because we were just talking about evangelizing and the faith, there is the Church of Kubertology that's out there right now.
This work is fun, kids. Hold on to your hats.
I just wanted to talk about how valid some of what they're talking about is, and some alternatives to that particular flavor of religion, if you will. We'll start with the basic premise that I think Kubernetes is founded on, which is container adoption is rampant, or at least that seems to be the impression. The CNCF just published their 2020 Cloud Native report, and something like 92% of respondents said they were using containers in production. Granted, that's a self-selected group that's more likely to be using that, but I'm curious if you're seeing that same trend out there in the field.
I'll just say, since 2016, I've learned that polling is not accurate.
Valid point.
The CNCF is a fantastic organization, and the group of folks who put it together, the Linux Foundation, all the folks that really pull all that stuff together. But they are truly speaking to a captive audience. They are genuinely a bit more involved in the ecosystem, so it is a bit of a skewed result. I find that I get from it, but it's true. So I'm seeing in legitimate customer environments, it's playing out, and I'm seeing massive customer adoption. And the funny thing is, I've lived through OpenStack, and I say that as if it was like I did.
You're a survivor.
I did
you made it, buddy.
There's two things that that people remember about OpenStack is that it won the private cloud war, and then that the private cloud war didn't matter at the time. And I got to say, that's the context, right? So at the time, it was inappropriate because there was no care for actually doing private cloud, because cloud as a practice, cloud architectures as a methodology didn't match the client server dominant application architecture. And so what we found was that it was misplaced, and it was too early. It was kind of before its time. It was like a open source hipster. It was just like way too cool before it was the right time. So for everybody that remembers that it was wrong because it didn't survive, it actually is thriving in telco and in different nations aside from North America, which also is where the polling has to be careful. If you're simply selecting from a North American audience, because we dominantly choose technology sort of voices from that audience, you'll find that in fact in APAC and APAJ and in Asia, a lot of A's, and they are strongly adopting for a lot of really neat reasons why open source succeeds greatly in a lot of Asian and South Asian areas, because they require by regulation for things to be open source. So anyway, so Kubernetes is next, right? I say Kubernetes is succeeding on the back of OpenStack. If OpenStack hadn't succeeded to a somewhat of a degree and then failed in enterprise, Kubernetes would never have gotten its start, because what we learned by trying to do private cloud, the private cloud was inappropriate, because the workloads we were building were suddenly sort of this Docker thing came along, and Docker was like really cool, and everybody was like, Docker, Docker, Docker. We got to do Docker. Are you doing Docker? I'm doing Docker. I'm wearing Docker shirts. They've got a better hoodie than everybody else, and so people went to containerization, and then they realized that Docker is, it's like saying, I got a fantastic tire. Awesome. What kind of car do you drive? Oh, I got a great tire. Like, that's what Docker was. It was a tire. It was meaningless without the rest of the machine around it. And then container schedulers came along, and so Kubernetes is, sort of the de facto container scheduler. It's winning the war, which we didn't know we were in a war, but that's kind of what it was. And we've seen it fall. Like we've seen, so Docker Swarm, Mesos. Oh, like Mesos and Marathon are, aside from Nomad, which we'll talk about in a second, not just because I've got a Nomad course on Pluralsight, but because I legitimately believe in the ecosystem. Mesos and Marathon were actually a fundamentally better scheduler. By science, we're a better scheduler. However, people like Nickelback too. Doesn't mean that they're a better band, but just means a lot of people buy Nickelback albums. Kubernetes is the Nickelback of technologies.
Wow. That's the pull quote right there. We're going to get a lot of flag. Well, Canada has a lot to answer for, especially with Nickelback.
Right. But as much as we make fun of it, it's broadly adopted in ways that are, so I'm a fan of what it's the long and the short of why I went through that story was that we went through the early pains so that we could actually do it again. This is kind of like sort of the sophomore effort of open source enterprise adoption, and containerization was appropriate now. And in fact, I'm going to say the enterpriseization, if that's a word, of Kubernetes is the next wave that we're in.